Good morning. We're looking still at the period of David's life when he was flying or fleeing from Saul. And I'm not going to go through every single verse and every single situation, but the pattern is that there is pursuit by Saul as opportunity came when he wasn't his land was not under attack from the Philistines or other peoples. He pursued David. There were people who betrayed David, and there were people who helped David. And Saul kept coming and going, kept chasing him, and there were many opportunities for David to stop and fight with Saul, with his men. His men had become a well-trained band of fighters. They'd been involved in a lot of battles, and they were very successful. David could have made the choice. He could have made the choice to take Saul out completely so that he wouldn't be doing this cat and mouse thing all the time and having to watch his back all the time. But he didn't. And chapter 24 is very important. Chapter 24 gives the first of at least two occasions when David could have killed Saul. Saul went into the cave at En-gedi in chapter 24. Saul went into this cave to relieve himself. So even Saul and David were human enough to need to do that kind of thing. I think the very old authorized version says he covered his feet, and that was a colloquialism, a bit like our spend a penny. It meant that he had to lift his robes to the front of him in order to be able to relieve himself. So I think it was probably a number 2. And he was vulnerable. David and his men were in that cave, in the very innermost part of that cave. And his men said, look, Saul has come in on his own to this cave. This is your opportunity. David, God has given your enemy into your hand. And David said a very important thing in verse 6. Well, first of all, he creeps up and cuts a bit of the robe off Saul's garment, to show how close he was to him. And he says to his men, when he comes back to them with the skirt, part of Saul's skirt, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put forth my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Now, this is trust in God in action. This is letting God determine what is right and wrong. He had the opportunity to kill Saul. There's absolutely no doubt about that. He could have killed Saul. He could have justified it by saying, well, God gave my enemy into my hand. He's just walked in. But if he'd killed Saul, he would have been a murderer. It would not have been in battle. It would have been in private fight. And it would have been evil. Thou shalt not kill. Even to destroy someone who's trying to kill you. It's one thing to kill somebody when they are attacking you and kill them in battle, but it's another thing to kill them when they're on their own and vulnerable, and you've got all these men with you, and he doesn't stand a chance. But that wasn't the point, really. It was that I will not lift up my hand against the Lord's anointed. Saul had been given his job as king by God himself through Samuel, and David was not going to kill someone God had anointed. He wasn't going to do it. Refused to do it. Now it's interesting, just as a thought that comes from this, that when the kingdom divides later on under Rehoboam and Jeroboam, in the northern kingdom, everyone, almost everybody, I'm trying to think of anyone that wasn't murdered by somebody who, there was coup after coup after coup in the northern kingdom. As soon as someone became strong enough, they slew the king on the throne and took over. And there was, I think the longest dynasty was Omri's dynasty with Ahab and Jezebel, and Ahab's son, and I think grandson. That was the longest dynasty. Everyone else, their ruling time on the throne of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, was only for their lifetime, because somebody took the kingdom by force and killed them, assassinated them. But in the southern kingdom, the kingdom where the king was a descendant, direct descendant of David, no king was killed on the throne and his throne taken away from him by the person who became his successor. There was a stability in the southern kingdom that didn't exist in the northern kingdom. And I think that this principle that David set was one of the reasons why the southern kingdom was so stable. It was because David made it a decree that he made it known that he would not, even to take the kingdom he knew God was giving him and God had promised him, he would not take the kingdom by force. He wouldn't do it. And we have to be careful how we achieve the things that God has promised us. We must do them by the right means. We must not usurp God's place over life and death. We mustn't do it. We mustn't make that choice. It's not ours to make. We are not Lord of life and death, and we should not make that choice. Being in wartime, that's very different. That is quite a different issue, a different thought about wartime. But I'm thinking about when we're not at war, and when we are not fighting for our country, but when we are simply living our lives. We must not take into our own hands the achieving of what we believe God has called us to. We must patiently wait for God to work it out and faithfully follow him until he does it. And that's what David did. Read the rest of chapter 24 and we'll talk about it tomorrow. God bless you. Have a great day. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.